Hackerrank easy algorithm sales by match. This question is fairly simple, and there are a couple different ways to write the code, of course. So, as we did recently, we will do a more long-winded version with a little bit more simple logic that takes a couple lines of code, and then we will do a second method that is nice, tidy, and very few lines of code. So as usual, first things first, let's understand what the question is asking of us. It gives the instance of socks. Essentially, each number in this array represents a type of sock. So let's say type 1 is black, type 2 is white, and type 3 is blue. Within this array, there would be one pair of black socks, one pair of white socks, and these three socks over here would be odds and ends. So it tells us that the length of the array, which is n, and will be provided, the length of the array will be between 1 and 100, as well as the kind of sock. Essentially, that means that this number could be anything from 1 to 100. Okay, so let's head over to Replit and start writing some code. So as I said, this first method will be a more long-winded method. I've copied over the information from the example that's provided at the bottom of that Hackerrank example. So what do we want to do? We want to find essentially how many times each of these numbers appear. If it comes out to even number, that means we've got pairs, and we'll want to see how many pairs we have and store that value somewhere. So one way we could go about this is to loop through a set of numbers, which could be 1 to 100, because we know each one of those numbers represents a type of sock. But we could also compress that range to only include numbers that are available in our array. And how we could do that is by setting some variables. We could set the low number of that range equal to min of the array. And then we could set high equal to the max, which would be the max of our array. And then, as I mentioned, let's go ahead and write our loop for n in range low to high, high plus 1. And that, of course, the plus 1 is to include the high number. If not, it would go to 1 below the high number. Okay, so there's our loop. And as usual, let's get printing. What will n be as we loop through this? Okay, there's our n. That's perfect. We're going to start at 10 and go all the way up to 50. So now that we have the type of socks that we could encounter, we want to take that first type and then loop through this array and keep track of the number of times that this number is equal to these numbers. So essentially, we have picked the lowest number sock type. Lowest number sock type is 10. We want to loop through this array and see how many times sock type 10 occurs. So how would we do that? We would write another loop for sock in array. And now let's go ahead and print. We'll get rid of this print, and we'll print an f string. We will print n equals n, and sock equals sock. So sock is going to be the item inside of our array. Just keep that in mind. Sock is what is in our array, and that you will be able to see when we run this code. Okay, so Let's break it down. First loop, first exterior loop, n will be equal to 10. We've got n equal to 10, and we're going to then loop through our array. When n is equal to 10, our first loop, our first iteration of our interior loop gives us sock 10. Our second iteration of our interior loop, which will give us this, 20, gives us sock 20. Our third iteration of our interior loop will give us again sock 20, because at this position, the next position, the sock value is 20. Next one's 10, next one's 10, and so on and so forth. So I hope you're seeing what's happening. We're doing our exterior loop to establish n, and then we are looping through the interior loop, keeping n constant that whole time. Okay, so that's great. That means we can actually start to keep track of some values. So this first iteration, n is equal to 10 and sock is equal to 10. And as I mentioned, we're going to want to keep track of how many times we encounter the same sock. So how could we do that? We could write a conditional statement within our loop. If sock equals n, we'll want to keep track of that type of sock, that number of that sock, and increase it by 1 each time it matches. So here, first iteration of this loop, 10, 10, we would add 1. Second iteration of that loop, 10, 20, we would not add 1. Third iteration, 10, 20, we would not add 1. Fourth iteration, 10, 10, we would add 1. And then, of course, we'd add 1 here, and we'd add 1 here, and eventually we would have 4. So we know that we want to store a value, number of sock. That means that we need to set that variable somewhere, and we would set it here, num of sock. So we're storing it here because this is our exterior loop, and we only want to keep track of the number of socks for that n. And then when we evaluate the next one, we'll want to keep track of the number of socks for that n. So that's why we wind up putting it right there. We can delete this. We no longer need that print. We've got our num of sock. So let's go ahead and print num of sock. I think we can print it here. Bear with me if not. Okay, let's go ahead and print. Okay, great. So this is, keep in mind what n would be. This line represents n of 10 for our exterior loop, and that would equal 4. This line represents 11 of our exterior loop. That would be 0 because there's no 11 that appears here. This would be 12, n would be equal to 12. There's no 12s in our array, so our counter never goes up, so on and so forth. This is where we get to n equals 20. When we get to n equals 20, we loop through this array. We see that there are 3 instances of 20. The counter keeps track of it. So that's awesome. That means that our num of sock variable is keeping track of the value we want at the point in time that we want it to. So how would we actually start keeping track of the pairs of socks in this whole array? So we know that in order for a pair to exist, there needs to be at least 2 of that kind of sock. So we can write if num of sock greater than or equal to, let's not do any typos, greater than or equal to 2, we would want to store it somewhere, right? There is a little caveat, so I guess we can just write it out first. So we'd want to store it somewhere. And we'd want to then add up all those values and return those values to get our answer. So what we can do is write a variable called pairs and set it equal to an empty array. And if the number of sock is greater than 2, that means we've got a pair, and we will pairs dot append a value. We would add a value to pairs, and that would be equal to num of sock divided by 2. And that should make sense, right? Because we'll keep track of our number of socks, but we only want to add a pair, which would be the number of socks divided by 2. So there we should have a pair. We should be keeping track of the pairs. So let's go ahead and print pairs. We still have this printing. Let's get rid of that for simplicity. Okay, so now we are storing the pairs that we have. So you can see here that while we're iterating through n equals 10, equals 11, 12, 13, and so on and so forth, we have stored the pairs of sock type 10, and we're getting a float because anytime you do division in Python, you get a float. And then we get to 20. There are 3 20s. So 3 divided by 2 gives us 1.5. But we don't want that, right? We know that there's only 3 pairs. There are 2 pairs of 10s and there's 1 pair of 20. This third 20 being an odd and end that we don't want to keep track of. So how could we write that? We can do a conditional statement inside of here where we could write if num of sock modulo 2 equals 0. That means we've got an evenly divisible number. We can just do this simple math, divide by 2, else. So what could else be? So we know we have a pair because we're still within this if conditional statement. So if the number of sock is greater than or equal to 2, it's going to go into these conditional statements. If it's evenly divisible, that means we've got 4 or 6 or 8. So we can just divide by 2 and append that. Else, we know we've got 2. So what would fall in the else? 3 could, 5 could, 7 could. So what would we want to do? We would want to pairs dot append not the number of sock divided by 2, but what we could do is num of sock minus 1, pop that in parentheses, and then divide that number by 2. And that will give us our number of pairs. So let's see what we get. Great, there it is. That's all fixed up. And then what do we want? So we have the number of pairs of 10s. We have the number of pairs of 20s. We know that there are no other pairs. If there were, they would be represented within this array. So we've got 2 and 1. Simplest way to get the total number of pairs would be the sum of the array, which we've called pairs. And not only do we want the sum, but because of the format of this question, we want the sum to be an integer. If we added these two numbers straight up, it would give us 3.0, but the format of the question wants the format to be an integer. So we could do answer, and then we could, in here, print answer. But in reality, we would go back over to Hackerrank and return answer rather than print. So that's the first method. If you type this all out into your Hackerrank console, you'll get the correct answer. But we are going to now move on to the second method. And second methods, in my book, typically utilize the power of Python. So what I just did was I had this line commented out from collections import counter, and that is because we are now going to utilize the counter function. Okay, so this is really powerful. It's hard to break it down first as I'm doing it. It's easier to write it out and then break it down from there. So the first step, we will write n equals counter with a capital C and put our array in there. And check this out. Let's see what happens. Let's print n. Check that out. Really, really powerful, right? It breaks down all the different kinds of numbers, the different kinds of values that we have within our array, counts the number of times that those occur, and parses them out into a dictionary. Really, really powerful function. If this is your first time encountering it, pretty simple. I hope you're following, and for sure it'll be something that you'll be using in the future. Okay, so now we've got this counter set up in n. What's amazing is that we can actually get the answer, return the answer in another line of code. And that will be sum I divide 2 for I in n dot values. And that will give us our answer. So for this, I will break that down. I don't want to just leave you guys hanging with that. Of course, you could play with it on your own, print different values and whatnot. But for the sake of this video, I figured it'd be good to go in and see what's actually happening. So essentially, in that return, there is a for loop built in. So let's go ahead and, as usual, break down our loop, see what's getting printed. So we saw in the first step where we printed what n is, we saw that 10 had 4, 20 had 3, 30 had 1, and 50 had 1. And that's what's happening here. We're just looping through those occurrences. We're not looping through the values, because the value would be 10, the value would be 20, 30, and 50. We're looping through the occurrences of those values in the dictionary. So there's the loop, there's what we're returning. And then we get even fancier. We'll print I divided by 2. So that would give you your pairs, because there's 4 occurrences of 10. Dividing by 2 would give us 2 pairs. So let's see what we get. 2.0, 1.5, and 0.5 2 times. And then you add this next divisor symbol, and look at that. It gives us exactly what we want. It rounds down. So we now have the number of pairs of 10s, the number of pairs of 20s. We want the sum of that. So we'll go ahead and rewrite this statement again. You can build the sum into this statement. I divide, that's 1. I divide 2 for I in n dot values parentheses. And that's it. That is our whole function. We'll go over, pop this back into, oh, don't need that. Yeah, pop this back into Hackerrank, run the code. Oh, of course we've got to import counter, because that doesn't come as standard in the Hackerrank system. Oh, it actually doesn't like it. Okay. So kind of a funny instance. If you were to interview and get this question as a technical interview question, this would be absolutely one of the best answers that you could provide. No denying that. Hackerrank, though, of course, has some kind of issue happening in their console where it won't accept this import, which is fine. So you would just use the other method to get credit for this question. There's other methods out there as well, of course. So go ahead and Google some that are a little bit cleaner than what we described today. But like I said, if you're getting interviewed, this is probably one of the most powerful solutions that you could provide. So study this, learn this value function, make use of counter, and test that out in some other iterations. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, please go ahead and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'll be posting a lot of these, and thanks for watching.